Good evening. Welcome once again to the Bible Speaks Today from LBC Television Ministries. We're on chapter 16 or verse 16 or sequence 16, program 16, the 16th time you've had to put up with me in this program. I don't know, whatever. It's 16 anyway. It's also my dear friend Cameron, the cameraman, Chief Cameron's birthday, so happy birthday to him. And I have to say he's younger than I am, so that's good. So, we're still talking about the writers of the Bible, who wrote the Bible, and I gave you a brief sort of update last week about the differences between J, E, D and P, you know, the sources of the Bible, and we're concentrating at the moment on what we call the source P, the priestly source, in other words, coming from the priests. And I made the point several times, I think, during the program, that how strict, how rigorous, how by the book, to the rules, the priestly source is, and as you'd expect. One of the things that even in the time of Jesus, with the Pharisees and the Sadducees, who were the priests, of course, who set themselves very high standards, who are very, you know, it's our way or the highway sort of thing. And this is one of the reasons why Jesus ran headlong into them, isn't it? But even back in the Old Testament times, back in, 500 BC, this sort of things, this was going on. We had two sets of priests, the Levite priests, who are the Mushites, who owed their allegiance or their genealogy through Moses, and the Aaronid priests, who owed their genealogy back through Aaron. And they had two different points of view. You might say the Aaronid priests were the conservatives, and the Levite priests were the liberals. I mean, I'm not saying they were liberal, but the difference in attitudes to things. And I went on. I was saying at the end of last week that Jeremiah knew and in fact used a lot of J.E. when he put together Deuteronomy, but he didn't quote very much from P. And some of the scholars have said, well, did he know P was out there? He must have known it. It was written, and he knew it quite well, we believe. It had to be written before Deuteronomy because, as I say, there were some quotes from it in Deuteronomy, but and some stories told from a different point of view. But Jeremiah didn't like it because it was obviously against the principles that his group, the Shiloh priests from the Levite descendants from Moses, believed. Okay, I mean it attacked his hero. It put Moses in a less elevated light as compared to, say, what the J&E sources have said, and he excluded the priestly laws out of into Deuteronomy. I mean, the P stories, the stories from P, I know it's kind of confusing, but the P source stories were present in Judah by the time of Jeremiah and Deuteronomy 1. Remember Deuteronomy 1 and 2? There was an original version of Deuteronomy, which we believe was written by Jeremiah, and then the revised version of Deuteronomy, which took into the fall of Judah and the captivity, if you remember. I'm not going to go over it again. If you weren't watching, you'll have to pick up back episodes of these programs on our website, or maybe email me and I'll tell you where you can get hold of some of the back copies, all right? But the point is that the P stories, and I'm hesitating that's what I said there because I want to make absolutely sure that they had to be written before Jeremiah put together Deuteronomy 1 and Josiah's death in 609 BC. Okay? So P was produced between, and I'm establishing a timeline by looking at the verse references, but somewhere after 722 BC and before 609, when Josiah died. So when you say, well, who was king then? And this is kind of critical. I mentioned it briefly last week. Who was king then? Well, it was King Hezekiah, who was Josiah's great-grandfather. King Hezekiah's reign, and you can read about Hezekiah in Kings, but King Hezekiah's reign emphasizes the centralization. In other words, it emphasizes one worship center, the temple. The priests in the temple do their thing. That's where you do. Now, there are, I don't want you to think that everybody had to traipse 100 miles to go to put sacrifice for their sins. People had to eat, and when they slaughtered animals, it was considered a sacrifice. But there was prayers to be said and a certain way of doing it, and if you couldn't get to the temple, then you could do it at home, on your farm, or whatever. But in general, when you wanted to seek forgiveness or pray for something special, you went to the temple, sacrificed there. And this, Hezekiah was big on this. Hezekiah was the one king, which is why there's so many favorable things. You know, he did good in the sight of the Lord and this sort of thing. Hezekiah was the one king up at that time who tried to bring the southern kingdom, Judah, back to the worship of the Lord in the way that he felt it should be done. And he was really big on this centralization. Now, it wouldn't work today, obviously. But as I say, Israel's, Judah then, a small country, probably worked better then. But if you read carefully, both in Kings and in Chronicles, they say very clearly that there was no centralization, no central religious point before him. So it's fairly obvious that P is the work of the Aaronite priesthood. And it's again fairly obvious that they are the ones who are in authority. Not the Levites, not the descendants of Moses. Okay? So the only priests around in positions of authority were descendants of Aaron. Now, the Levite priests who were there before, they're still there, but they're like second-class citizens. They're doing the donkey work. The real, serious upper level, upper echelon, call it what you will, was the Aaronite priests. It's kind of interesting that among all the four sources, among J, E, D, P, whatever, all the four sources of the first 5 books, only P, standalone, sees the priests as distinct from the Levites. You see the expression over and over again, the priests and the Levites, or they refer to the Levite priests doing their thing. They make it very clear. I mean, Deuteronomy uses the term Levite priests, but P never does. It's priests and Levites, separate group altogether. It talks of 2 separate groups. Never the twain shall meet. We're in charge, you're the helpers. And the P document emphasizes this class distinction, if you will, over and over again. Chronicles, if you read Chronicles, which is, more of a history thing, written later, or written at the time but added later, the divisions of the priests and the Levites. So they're not even calling the Levites priests at this time. They're just the priests and the helpers, this sort of thing. And it mentions that each has its own task. So the priests do the sacrificing and all the good stuff, and the Levites do the cleaning up, I guess. Something like that, anyway. But, here's another thing. How I don't say down and dirty it got, but how critical it became in all of this. If you remember back in the 40 years in the desert, and the snakes, remember Moses had the bronze snake put on a stick, and if they looked on it, they wouldn't get stung by the snakes. I personally have always had a problem with that, because that's sort of like idolatry, and I wondered how that fitted with thou shalt have no other gods and all this sort of thing. But anyway, I never thought much about it until I was reading this passage when I was researching this program. But this bronze serpent called the Neshutan was a big reminder. Was still carried in I assume in a temple. Was a big reminder to everybody of Moses and Moses' power and Moses' leadership. You know, there's the staff of Moses with the snake on the top, right? So what does Hezekiah do? King Hezekiah smashes that. There's the national hero of Israel, or Judah, or the Israelites, call it what you will. Here's something from Moses, descended from Moses, been with us hundreds and hundreds of years, and King Hezekiah smashes it. Why? Because King Hezekiah supports the Aaronid priesthood, the descendants of Aaron. And so he actually destroys one of the few remnants of tangible remnants, if you will, that are of Moses. It's quite amazing, really. There's nothing more said about it. He just smashes them up. But it's the best thing that ever happened to the Aaronid priesthood, because now they've got somebody going to bat for them. I mean, it's great if you've got the king on your side. You're laughing. And P very much reflects the age of Hezekiah. If you read the story of Hezekiah, it's very much his thing. Now, you remember we talked about Deuteronomy, how Deuteronomy and Jeremiah's writing there reflects the work of Josiah. Remember I said that everything that Josiah did is reflected in Deuteronomy, and how in Deuteronomy Josiah is the great man who can do no wrong. Unfortunately, he got killed far too soon, and then, of course, the whole thing went downhill rapidly from then. I mean, there are two works in the Bible, fun enough, two works, and I mentioned this before too, that tell the history of the Israelites. Okay? The early history, anyway. One of them is in Deuteronomy. Okay? One of them is in Jeremiah's Deuteronomy, which does give you that in Moses' farewell address, you get the potted history of the Israelites. The other is in 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Deuteronomy originated from out of and was written by a priest from Shiloh, Levite priest, Jeremiah. Chronicles is actually written by the Aaronids. So there's the two different points of view. Chronicles makes a hero of Hezekiah. You may not know this, and I had to look at this fairly quickly before I came in tonight. There are some 80 verses in Chronicles about Hezekiah that are not in, or not even mentioned, in Kings. Kings and Chronicles are basically the same, and you probably have noticed that. The two kings that stand out in all of Israel's history are Solomon and Hezekiah. Okay? Josiah's there as well, but most people will obviously know who Solomon is, and half the people would know Hezekiah. Yeah, he was one of the good kings, wasn't he? Okay. The Deuteronomic history has a whole chapter on Solomon, and blames him, quite simply blames him for the division of the nation. Now, we know that what happened was that Rehoboam, who took over from Solomon, his son, refused to make the changes that the northern kingdom wanted, the things that Solomon put upon them, and the changes with the ruling governors and the missim, the 1 month a year to the state and that sort of thing. Deuteronomic history blames him point blank. If Solomon hadn't done this, we wouldn't have the division. Chronicles doesn't even mention it. The history of Israel in Chronicles doesn't even mention that. So let's go back to Hezekiah. A lot of this is background, but it may help you understand why things were written the way they were. Hezekiah begins his reign around about the fall of the northern kingdom. Okay? As soon as the northern kingdom falls, Hezekiah is the king. Now he's got an increase of population. He's got refugees, people coming in from the north. At some point during that time, I mean, not in a couple of weeks, but over a period of months, maybe a year, so J and E are combined. Now, you're an Aaronid priest. Now they combine J and E, which is a real Levite supporting document. But Hezekiah has given the Aaronid priests the pride of place. So the Aaronid priests come up with their own version of the story to counteract the JE combination that's being touted around by the other group. Okay? We know a lot of this because Hezekiah's reign fits the evidence that we see and the history. P almost certainly had to be written after the fall of the northern kingdom and before Jeremiah began preaching, before Ezekiel began preaching, and before the fall of Judah. Now, there's some compelling reasons for that too. That period of time, historically, and we have, there's the facts to back it up with, if you say, was a time of great literary production in Judah. In other words, a whole lot of writing got done in Judah during that time. Presumably there weren't too many wars going on. Everything was fairly copacetic. Because what happens in that period of time, the book of Isaiah, or the books of Isaiah, of Micah, Hosea, and Proverbs were written. In the background of all that, there was also a sort of history of Solomon to Hezekiah written, which in fact became part of Kings and the Chronicles later on. It was written as a separate history. And in all of this, centralization was the key. Here's the temple, here's where you should go, the priests are in charge, do it their way. Now, we don't know the author of P. We don't know who physically he was, any more than we know who wrote J and E. We know who put them together, J and E. Okay, but we don't know who actually wrote them. We do have some clues about the language of P, through the language, rather, I should say, and some other clues that about P. As I said before, he absolutely had to be an Aaronid priest. Now, was he one person, or was it several people? How do you tell? Well, you tell by looking at the writing and seeing how it comes together. And we've talked about this so many times in our Bible studies, that where more than one person has written it, it's usually fairly easy, relatively easy, to pick out who wrote what because of the different syntax, the different grammar and this sort of thing. Okay? It seems to be, if you read P on its own, just one person. If you take P, the source P, all the verses in it, out of J and E, like I said earlier, we have J, E, D, and P. If you take it on its own and read it, it's a continuous flowing story. It leaves out a lot that's in the others, and it puts stuff in that isn't in the others. But it's a continuous flowing story. The laws, however, the priestly laws that are in there, they may be from different sources. And the reason for that is, well, there's several reasons for it. One of them is there's a document. There was an Aaronid document, in other words, a document produced by the Aaron group, shall we say, called the Holiness Code. It was initially a separate standalone document. And the laws in that, the Holiness Code, I think is, this is what you've got to do to be holy. That document was put into P together with some of the laws that they actually had existing in the day, as far as, how many times you had to wash and this sort of thing. And there's some legal material in there too, if you read it carefully. But what it did was it formed a definitive law code. So here we are. P writes their version of the story with their own law codes in it, and probably had access to JE documents. So in other words, quite possibly whoever was putting this together had the J&E document in front of him. So he could look at it and say, well, that's not right. No, we don't believe that, and put this in. Okay? So, and if you get really into it, and I don't expect most of you will want to do that too much after hearing all what I've said, but if you get into it, you'll find that a lot of scholars will say that the the literature in P is not as good as the literature in JE. In other words, it's more to the point, more pithy, more abrupt, it doesn't flow like J&E does. Okay, well, maybe the priests weren't concerned with it being easy to read. They were concerned with making sure we get the facts, man, all right? And the great irony of the whole thing is that it was produced as an alternative guide, story, whatever you want to call it, to JE. It was an alternative. And then someone combined them. Think about it. All the differences in there. Aaron group feels this way, Levite group feels that way, or the Mushite group feels this way. We believe this is the law, we believe this is the law. You know, somebody combined them. And not just combined them, but intertwined, interlaced them. It's really, really difficult to see what is JE and what is P. You can do it if you've been given the sort of guidelines to it, but it intertwined and interlaced them so much so that they all merge together. Now, they can be a little confusing because they say one thing here, another thing there, but in the whole, it makes sense. And we know that because we're reading it today. And at the end of this, the person who put all this together, now it's later on, has Deuteronomy, and he puts Deuteronomy as the conclusion. All right? So you have all your differences put in together. I mean, it's an amazing document. You think how difficult it is to do that. Someone merged 4 different, and in some cases, opposing sources. You don't tell me the hand of God isn't in here somewhere. All right? Opposing sources. Not diametrically opposed, but certainly with different viewpoints on how things should be. One document's full of Moses, one document's full of Aaron, one document's full of how the Levite priest should be in charge, and one document's how the Aaron priest should be in charge. All these differing opponents, so skillfully, they did it so skillfully, it would take over 1,000 years, literally, before anyone really could even start to work it out. This was the person who created what we call the Torah, the first 5 books of Moses that we have read for over 2,000 years. When we started this series, and no, we're not finishing it tonight, don't worry. When we started this series, I said Moses did not write the Bible. All right? So, who did? Well, the most likely person that we have scholars and historians and Bible scholars and people like me reading books and looking at things, the most likely person to have merged all this together in such a way as it would all work together is Ezra. You all know who Ezra was. Okay, well you don't. We're going to be finding out more about him very shortly. Okay? Ezra, that person who did this, and we think it's Ezra, would be known as a redactor. If you're up on your literature, you'll know that a redactor arranges texts that are already written and putting them into a more, we call them maybe an editor today, putting them into a more understandable format. If you let's say you wrote a textbook today about, video camera maintenance, this thing I could think of, and you wrote it and somebody say, yeah, but you need to say this before that, and you need to put that chapter before that because that leads naturally onto there. So somebody edited the text, and yeah, they added a little bit, but writing not very much himself. Not very much himself. And I say it's Ezra, and there really isn't a great deal of evidence in the sense that, oh yeah, there's Ezra's handwriting. But we know it was an Aaronid priest, or maybe, if you like, someone aligned with them. Because all the major stories in the Torah, in the first 5 books, all the major stories begin with P stories. In other words, examples from P. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, all begin with the P version of the story. The P document is as a framework. In other words, the J and E goes in there, but the P document is the framework. I mean, look at the begats. Remember that? All the begats, so-and-so begat so-and-so, you all remember that, learning that when you're in Sunday school. Originally, this was the Book of Generations. It was a book separate on its own called the Book of Generations. It was skillfully cut into several pieces and interspersed into the stories, all right? Put in the stories. So otherwise, you gave a few begats, then told the story about them, then you gave a few more, and then told the story about them, and so forth. So you gave the stories organization and continuity. And the Book of Generations, by the way, was a P document because it uses Elohim and not Yahweh. Remember back at the beginning we discussed this? All this had to happen in the days of the Second Temple, and that's where we're going to pick it up next week. Okay? Read through those first 5 books if you have the time. That is the same document you're reading today as, we believe, Ezra put together in the days of the Second Temple. Until next week, good night. God bless.